In this video, we're going to review factoring quadratics. Before you attempt this lesson, just make sure you're comfortable with factoring with the greatest common factor. If I have something like this, make sure you can rewrite it like this. If not, just make sure you get some extra help from me before you continue. So the idea. Factoring just means breaking a thing down into its most basic parts. What are the factors of 30? Well, I could do 30 is 10 times 3. 10 is 5 times 2. So 30, the most basic factors of 30 are 2, 3, and 5. We can't break those down into smaller things with multiplication. So that's what factoring means. What are the factors of x squared plus 4x plus 4? Kind of what makes up this expression? It ends up being x plus 2 and x plus 2. But just like 30, we broke it down to kind of things that multiply together to get that number here. These are the things that multiply together, in this case FOIL together, to get this quadratic. So when you're factoring quadratics, we always just do the same thing over and over again. So it's just a process you have to keep doing until you kind of get it in your head and you can do it every single time. The way I've been teaching you is called the splitting method. And most of the times I say it doesn't matter if you know the name of this thing, but this one case when knowing the name's helpful because the splitting method is one of the major steps. It's that step 3 where you split that middle term into two separate terms. And what are those two separate terms? They're the numbers that add together to the middle number and multiply together to the outside pair. And then from there you just factor down. So 20x squared plus 11x minus 3. This is A, this is B, and this is C. It's only A, B, and C because it's in the order x squared, x constant. We need to find two numbers that add together to give 11. They need to multiply together to give 20 times negative 3. Make sure you don't forget your negatives. They need to give negative 60. So this is where, at the beginning, when you're first getting used to this, I just kind of list out the possibilities. How can you multiply to give 60? Well, there's always 1 in the number, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If I were to do 60 divided by 7, it doesn't work. 8 doesn't work. 9 doesn't work. And then now I've got back to 10, which is already in the other column, so I've kind of already looped around. All right, so these are all the ways you can multiply to give 60. I want to multiply to negative 60 and add to 11. So which pair is going to work? It's going to be the ones that have a difference of 11, 4 and 15. And which one should be negative? The 4 should be negative because when I add them, I want to get a positive number. So positive 15 and negative 4 is the pair I want. That's really the most mentally challenging part because you're kind of going through all these ways to multiply and add. I would always make sure you double check. Negative 4 times 15 is negative 60, so that's right. Negative 4 plus 15 is positive 11, so that's right. Always make sure you double check your numbers or else everything after this is wrong. But now, again, it's called the splitting method because once I have these numbers, I split that middle term. Instead of 11x, now I have minus 4x's and plus 15x's. So notice because this term had the x that I'm splitting, both these terms have the x's, and these are the exact numbers that came from my perfect pair. And then why do you split it? You split it because now I have 4 terms, and I can think about these 4 terms as 2 groups of 2. The first group of 2, the biggest thing they have in common, 4 divides 4 and 20, and they both have an x. If I take a 4 from a 20, 20 divided by 4 is 5, and I get rid of one of these x's, so there's still one x left. When I factor out a 4x from a 4x, this is the most common mistakes. Factor out the whole thing, you get a 1, not a 0, right? You're like dividing 4x out. It's the opposite of distribution. My second pair, the biggest thing that divides both these numbers is 3. And this term does not have an x, so I can't put an x here. That's another common mistake. 15 divided by 3 is 5. That x is still there. 3 divided by 3 is 1. Here's another time to check yourself. These two things, 5x minus 1, those have to be the same. If those are not the same, look at your work and figure out what you did wrong. If these are not the same, you did something wrong, because that's half your answer, that part that is the same. And the other half of your answer is the stuff you factored out, 4x plus 3. right? And that's your final answer. All right, so there's a lot of places where you can make small mistakes that give you the wrong answer. All right, picking the wrong numbers here, putting the negative in the wrong place, all right, not factoring out the greatest common factor, all right, not making sure these numbers match up. All right, it's the same algorithm. You just have to double check yourself as you go. And one way you can always check your final answer, if I FOIL this out, I should get back to where I started. 5x times 4x is 20x squared. Negative 4 and 15 is 11x. Negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. So if you're kind of not confident in your factoring, FOIL the final answer and make sure you get it right. If not, try it again, figure out these numbers, figure out your factoring, and try it again. All right, in this example, we can actually use one of our shortcuts. All right, so we learned a couple different shortcuts. One is if there's a 1 in front of x squared, we can simplify this whole process. So the process is I'm going to look to add to positive 1, because that's the number in the middle, and multiply 1 times negative 30 is negative 30. All right, so let's do this part first. This part, never a shortcut for this part. Negative 30, I can multiply 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 4 doesn't work, 5 and 6. 6 would be the next number, but it's in this column, so I'm done. So these are the ways I can multiply to give 30. And I want to multiply to, or sorry, add to positive 1, so it's going to be 5 and 6 with a negative 5. Negative 5 and positive 6, multiply to negative 30. Negative 5 and positive 6, add to 1. Again, always double check that. And now the shortcut, only when there's a 1 in front of this x squared, the shortcut is, you don't have to do all the splitting method, you just write x minus 5, which is coming from here, and then x plus 6. There's nothing wrong with doing the whole splitting method, it's just 5 extra steps you don't have to do. So the shortcut is when there's just a 1 in front of the x squared, you basically go straight to your answer using that perfect pair that you found. All right, x squared minus 16. This one, we could do the splitting method again. We could do x squared plus 0x, right? That x term isn't there, so there's a 0 in front of it. And do our splitting method, we want to add to 0 and multiply to negative 16. You could do it like that. Everything in this kind of red box is valid and true. We also learned another thing called a difference of squares, that if I have two things that are perfect squares with a minus sign between them, they factor like this. Again, this is just another shortcut. It's not something you have to do, but it saves you a lot of time, because now you realize that x squared is just x squared, so that goes in the first parts. 16 is 4 squared, so that's going to go in the second parts. I put a plus sign in one and a minus sign in the other. It doesn't matter which one you put first, minus or plus. All right, so that's just another shortcut. Nothing wrong with doing the splitting method like you would do in this red box. It's just more steps you don't have to do. All right, so here's one to try on your own. I go ahead and factor this quadratic. All right, this one, just as a kind of warning, there is no shortcut because there's a 6 in front of the x squared, and there's not a minus perfect square there. All right, so you have to do this the splitting method way. I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. And the final answer you get when you factor it is 2x plus 1 times 3x plus 4. All right, so quick summary. You have to remember the factoring algorithm. There's not really any way. You might have learned a different way to factor, and that's fine. But you have to remember some way to factor quadratics, because it's basically the basis for so many of the types of problems that you have to solve. All right. And then, although the shortcuts save time, make sure you can rely on the splitting method, and then also make sure you only do the shortcuts at the appropriate times. All right, only do the first shortcut we talked about when there's a 1 in front of the x squared. The other shortcut is when you have a perfect squared thing minus another perfect squared thing. So if you saw like 4x squared minus 9, that one you could do that difference of squares. All right, so make sure you're only doing shortcuts when you're able to. Figure out those. All right, learn the splitting method first, and then learn the shortcuts so you don't make too many mistakes.